So this afternoon, as you know, well, first of all, let me ask the people who are online to please turn on your cameras. That's a request from the management here. So today, as you know, we're going to be talking about our friend Jim and make reflections about him, tell stories about him. I'm really looking forward so much to hearing what people have to say. I mentioned this morning that we were hoping that Pam and two of her daughters were going to be here, but they're not here yet. So they might be arriving. Let's hope so. The way we're going to do this is I have a list of people who I already contacted to ask them if they'd be willing to speak. And then after they speak, we're going to open it up to the floor and then also to people online for anybody who would like to speak about Jim. But before we speak about Jim, let's give Jim another opportunity to speak to us.
Tell us a little bit about your childhood and growing up Catholic in the Bronx, and how do you think that's shaped you in the years that have followed?
To quote Steve Martin, I was born at a very young age. It was fun growing up in the Bronx when I grew up. We grew up in a working class area, somewhat ethnically segregated, but except for the Italian neighborhoods, which were really, they were segregated, mixed up. And we had a great time. It was tons of kids together. You could do whatever you want. You could get in trouble if you wanted. You can go play ball all the time. The transportation system in New York was phenomenal and cheap. So as soon as you got to be 10 or 11 years old, you could get a quarter and go down to Manhattan and do whatever you wanted. And so I enjoyed that. It was a completely working class area. I sincerely believe that I never met a professional person until I was 30, till I left New York. So there were mostly only people like me, like our family, my father was a bus driver for the city and a trade union guy. And he was active. He didn't have a leadership role, but when the Transport Workers Union in New York got organized under a very interesting gentleman called Red Mike Quill, he was a fast-standing guy. And so I didn't have politics as but I did have a kind of unconscious class consciousness. And I knew there were us, and then there were other people who more or less, I don't know, made the rules, passed the laws, did the things.
Yeah, because this is, I mean, one of the things, the story that I've always liked that you told me was about the Catholic nuns that you used to, that shaped you. And could you tell us a little bit about that? So.
Well, my parents were Irish immigrants, and at that time, at least officially, the Irish immigrant community just did whatever the church said. Or at least it insisted that everybody else do whatever the church said, and God would maybe see you when you were doing what you weren't supposed to be doing. So I went to Catholic elementary school, and the nuns were just like any set of people. There was, various different kinds of people. I had some wonderful women. They were always very mysterious to us. They seemed kind of neutral between. I mean, they were women, but they were covered up. It was like the Burkers, really. They were completely covered. I was going to say we knew they must have feminine figures, but we couldn't see them. And some of them were really tough. I had an Irish nun named Sister Stevens, who was an old woman, and her hearing was bad. And I remember one day at the beginning of a class, when we had a class, everyone was afraid of her. And she would turn around to the chalkboard to write something, and someone would talk, and she'd turn around and say, "Stop that talking." But she didn't know where it was coming from. So anyway, the second time she turned around, walked into the front row, grabbed my friend Eddie, took him up by the hair, banged his head off the board, and sat him down again. And she was left with a lot of his hair. So the church ruled with a tough hand. A lot of the nuns taught me to watch out for them. I became very skeptical about religion as an elementary school student, because they taught me about a loving God but a vengeful God. And so if you crossed God, you were in big trouble, and you would burn in the fires of hell forever. And I thought, well, my father's not so good, but he's not going to burn me in the fires of hell forever. But if we can fast forward, I did discover later on that there are always been two churches, two Catholic churches. There's a formal church, a power structure church, a top-down church, and many, over the course of history, a church that officially does very bad things like the Inquisition and the slaughter of the native populations in Latin America and North America. But there's always another church, and its size changes and so on, which is a bunch of wonderful people, dedicated people, wonderful, decent people. I did a week-long course on Catholic teaching and social justice at the Maryknoll Mission Institute in Ossining, New York, in the, I don't know, maybe the late 80s, and there were about 45 nuns, and they were all the Maryknoll sisters. They were working in Latin and Central America, and there was a bunch of them had gotten killed, murdered by the officials there. And they were probably the nicest set of people I've ever met, and the most dedicated set of people I've ever met. We went out to socialize 2 nights in the town in a bar, and I remember asking a young woman who was sitting next to me what she did, and she said, well, she worked in Haiti up in the mountains, and she and another sister had a little dispensary, and the peasants all brought their children up to be treated when they were sick at their dispensary, and they often died. They didn't have much. They didn't, it was limited medications. There's all these, so it was a very sad state. I asked her, what do you do for a social life? She said, oh, we have a great social life. She said, once a month, the bishop of something comes up on his donkey and we have tea. And I thought, this is an awful way to live. I said, how do you feel about going back? She said, I can't wait. And these were the people I thought, if there was a revolution, I wanted to be with them, but not with Sister Stevens.
We're so happy to have Pam Crotty here and Alexis and Aaron Crotty who have joined us. So they are here with us today. There's a group of people, as I said, I've asked to speak. I initially told them to speak 2 to 5 minutes. And then Michael Hillard said, what? 2 to 5 minutes? And it reminded me of when Jim used to say when he was going to a conference and they'd give him 10 or 15 minutes to speak. And Jim would say, it takes me 15 minutes to clear my throat. So Michael kind of channeled Jim and asked for a few more minutes. So I'm now telling people you can have anywhere from up to 5 or 10 minutes. Up to 5 or 10 minutes. I'll try to hold you to it. The first person I'm calling on is my great friend and colleague and co-director, Bob Pullen.
Hi. Great seeing you here, everybody. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, look, it's just great having everybody here. I have to tell how I got to know Jim Crotty. We're going to hear a lot of interesting stories, sure, but I'm going to compete. I'm going to say my way of connecting with Jim Crotty may be the most unusual. Okay, so, and I'm going to have to give a little biography to get there. So let's say it's 1973, the oil crisis, OPEC raises oil prices 300%. And I was working at a mainstream newspaper as an underling called the Washington Star. It was the second. There was the Post and there was the Star. And I didn't know anything about economics. I hadn't taken any classes or anything in college. I'd read 2 books in total. No, 3. I read Squeezy and Baran, Monopoly Capital. I read Ernest Mandel, Marxist Economic Theory, and I read Robert Heilbronner, Worldly Period. That was it. And I was working at the paper, and so it was the crisis. And I said, well, I guess, I'm a leftist. I should actually understand something about this. And so I asked the reporter, and these were like pretty big time reporters, Washington Star. I asked the economics reporter who was covering this session, I said, so, how do you really analyze this? And he said, I said, do you know any economics? He said, oh, no. He said, no, if you're a Democrat, you call a Democratic economist. If you're a Republican, you call a Republican. And that's how you write your stories. Well, that just didn't seem very satisfying. So I wandered over to American University, then and still now, had a radical economics contingent. I really have no idea how I knew that was the case, but I went there, just walked in and talked to the secretary, and I was told, well, if you want to take classes, go talk to this other guy named Jim Weaver. I'm going to get to the, well, I'd have my 5 to 10 minutes. I'll get there. Okay, so I go to Jim Weaver. Some of you know of Jim Weaver. Okay. And so Jim Weaver said, I talked to him for a little while about my interest, and I was working at the paper and I want to be able to, understand this economic calamity. And he said, oh, well, you should take classes. There's a guy, and you don't know any economics, so you can take intermediate macro or intro macro and intro to statistics. And the professor is somebody named Ray Bodie. There he is, my first economics teacher. And how lucky was that to walk in out of nowhere, to walk into Ray Bodie's office before I ever took a class. I told him what I was interested in. And he said, you know what, I think you'd be interested in this new paper I have with this other guy. And he gave me the typescript of what we're now saying is the legendary Bodie and Crotty paper on class struggle and the business cycle. That was the first economics paper I ever read, much less ever heard about. I didn't know there were such things as, papers and so Ray introduced me to all of that. And not only that, he not only showed me the paper, but then he said, oh, you want to see, we just got the referee report, what's a referee report? There's a referee report from a new journal called The Review of Radical Political Economics. I said, well, that sounds good. And he showed me the referee report by somebody else that I'd never heard of, who in the room, Sam Bowles. So Sam Bowles was the referee saying, this is a really important paper. It's new stuff. And I'm thinking, oh my God, economics, this is fabulous. And that Ray and this guy named Crotty, nobody else had thought of this. This is like from Marx all the way to Bodie and Crotty. Anyway, that was how I first heard the name Jim Crotty. That didn't mean I ever met Jim Crotty. But then from there, from AU, I went to the New School, and I never had any interaction with Jim Crotty until I was on the job market as a new PhD, finishing graduate school. And, in those days, you actually had to mail everything, so I sent out my 100 or so applications, including here. And my dissertation was on finance, trying to bring together, kind of like what we're hearing with Jim Crotty, Marx and Minsky and post-Keynesian and so forth. And so I sent out all my applications. And the first thing I get back, any response whatsoever from any place, is a place I really, really wanted to think about coming to, was this place. And it was a letter from somebody, it was Jim Crotty. And Jim Crotty said, your dissertation work looks really, really interesting, and I'd love to talk to you about it sometime, but there's no way we can hire you. And that's because we have a deal here at UMass, and the deal is 1 year, the radicals get to hire somebody, and the next year, the straight people get to hire somebody, and we can't hire you because you're a lefty. And I'm thinking, what? Jim Crotty, a lefty, is telling me he won't even consider me for the job. Well, that was the case. And so I was so disturbed by that. My first interaction with Professor Jim Crotty, I wrote out letters to all 100 places that I had applied. Again, those days it was letters and stamps and, licking the envelopes, all that. And I said, I really protest any place that is going to discriminate against me on the basis of me doing this work that has a Marxian component. And even at a highly touted, the top place doing Marxian economics, I'm being discriminated against. And that's how I got to know Jim Crotty. So I saw him at the conference, because again, in the old days, you were interviewed at these conferences and everyone's in the hallway. And I didn't know what, but I see this guy with the badge, Crotty UMass, and I said, Jim Crotty, it's you. And I said, how could you do this? How could you discriminate against me? And he just said, good luck with your position. And he walked away. That was my first interaction with Jim Crotty. So it was all improved from there. Now, the way I really connected, so Jim did actually, he wasn't just being polite. It turns out he was interested in my dissertation topic because he was working on the same thing, which has been touted as another one of Jim's classic papers on Marx and finance, which was a great paper. And it's interesting that it was now called a classic paper because it was in this totally obscure, it was this book that was, it was a Festschrift in honor of Paul Sweezy and Harry Magdoff, but the publisher was Autonomia or something like that. Anyway, it was a great paper. And Jim, made this critical point that I was kind of talking about in my own dissertation work, which was that unless you incorporate the role of finance, just having, a falling rate of profit, whatever is causing it, you just have a falling rate of profit. There is no transmission mechanism. So Jim was really, truly a pioneer in developing that and continuing that. And as Jerry said earlier, by the time of the financial crisis, Crotty had been telling us what was happening, what was going to happen for years and years in a way that nobody else was. So that's kind of, I followed Jim's work and we met at a couple of conferences, but really, I didn't really know him very well until 16 years later. And then I'm being considered again for a position here. And I said, Jim wrote to me again, letters, and he said, well, we really want you to come. And I said, you mean this is not one of the years where you're going to hire the straight people? I said, you're really going to consider me? Well, yes, was the answer. And I came, my wife Sigrid and I came, and Jim and Pam had a wonderful party for us. And that was a really beautiful occasion. And we've got to be close friends with Jim and Pam ever since. So I will just mention a couple of other anecdotes and points. Jim and I, of course, had a lot of mutual interests, especially in macro finance issues. But probably the thing on which we bonded most was basketball. So Jim was a really good basketball player, and he was a very careful student of basketball. And I guess I won't say I was a good player, but we followed the, we would start talking about macro finance, and then somehow it would always veer into something to do with the NBA. And somehow that would get more spirited than anything else. So those were the kinds of discussions that we had. We worked together with many, many students on dissertation committees, and Oscar being one of them, Josh Mason being another, both of whom are here. Just to mention a couple of other anecdotes about Jim. So I was at SOAS in London for about a week, something or other. And I was just there, and so it was a week. So I didn't have a full change of clothes. So I was on my way, literally in London, bringing my laundry, trying to find a laundromat. And I'm just walking down the street, and I don't neighborhood, where SOAS. So I'm walking down the street, and who do I see? Jim and Pam Crotty. So Jim and Pam and I got together with me carrying my laundry, and we just hung out in London. And that was another fun occasion. The only other thing I'll mention is what an honor it was for us at Perry here to be able to have this beautiful building for us, signed by my wife, which is the first zero emissions energy building in the region. And when we thought about how we were going to put this thing together, the first thing we thought of, we wanted to name it in honor of Jim and Pam. So that is hopefully a permanent way for us to honor everything that you and Jim contributed to our.
Next up, I'm going to call on Don Mychek. Are you here, Don? Don is a very, and his wife are very, and kids, good old friends of Pam and Jim. And I hear he's a really great cook.
Okay, it's great to be back at UMass, where I worked in the mid-70s for the student organizing project, which was in a wild effort to form one big union of students. I took the student government funded job after discussing it with Jim Crotty, who quietly championed student activism, but even though he wasn't crazy about my anarcho-syndicalist tendencies. I knew Jim for 50 years. He was my teacher, my mentor, a confidant in matters of life and love, the unlikely, unofficial godfather of my two daughters, a golfing partner, a welcome critic of my longtime newspaper reporting and burgeoning crime novels, and most important, my dear, dear friend. He and his wonderful wife, Pam, dined at our home every Saturday night for decades. And we always shared Christmas at their home, where Karl Marx, rather than the baby Jesus, lay in a manger underneath the tree. Like anyone, Jim had his faults. He could, for example, be an unrelenting hard ass. He never stopped complaining that I still owed him a paper from college, an issue I think was finally settled when I wrote his obituary for the local paper. But this was a guy with rapier wit, wonderful sense of humor, and an undying love of music. He'd lead sing-alongs of IWW songs. He'd start Dark as a Dungeon and I had to join in. But it wasn't just political music. After we saw the Neville Brothers in concert in Northampton, he never missed the chance, years later, to turn around and look at us and say, you know, we've been Nevilleized, which if you saw a concert, you get, but just roll it. He'd also occasionally break into song with the Chieftains or Dion and the Belmonts or Ry Cooder or practically anybody, and you had to join. You know, I've thought a lot about what to say about Jim's life and work to a gang of once and future economists. His exemplary academic career and his publications speak for themselves. But the most important thing about this kid from the Bronx, whose father was a bus driver and whose mother a telephone company worker, is that he never forgot his working class. That's why when I graduated from bourgeois Bucknell University, he left the stage in his academic robes, would personally congratulate my father, my post office longtime mail carrier father, my homemaker mother, about getting their kid through college. They cherish that memory, and it's the sort of profound working class solidarity that he tried hard to show his entire life. It's also the lesson for all of you then. Jim rarely spoke about the political crap that initially denied him a doctorate at Carnegie Mellon, or the police red squad that forced him to leave the University of Buffalo and brought him to Bucknell. But Jim is featured in a series of brief interviews. They're on YouTube, among other places, where he lays out a lot of it. And I urge you to watch and learn, because he's still teaching and seeking truth and speaking truth to the ruling class, wherever they may be, autocratic politicians or corrupt profiteers. That's all I have to say. I'd be happy to talk to any of you later. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Don. The next person on my list is Michael Hillard. 5 to 10 minutes.
All right, I did something not that smart and I neglected to write down what my outline was. So I hope I get this right within the limited time period. I'm so honored to come and speak about Jim's life and what a wonderful person he was. I'm going to talk a little bit about my connection to him as an economics student in the program. I'm also going to talk about our friendship, Pam and Jim, and my wife, Marcia Goldenberg, who couldn't be here. She's having a slight health issue, but she sends her love to you, Pam, and the kids. And the wonderful times we spent over really decades together and what it meant. We'll say a little bit about, I was a graduate student in the early 80s. It was a heady time. There were camps, people arguing with each other. And then there was Jim Crotty. And Jim Crotty, we used to use jokes like the non-aligned movement of graduate students or whatever. But, the one place where I think all the graduate students really came together in terms of their learning and excitement to become a political economist and go out and fight the class struggle in the world as such was in 706. And I'm going to speak not as somebody who wound up doing a dissertation with him. And I think there's so many people I know of, Erzger and Dymski and Eileen Grable, who did great work under his mentorship. And I didn't quite go in that direction. But there's another way in which he had a huge impact on the world, which is that he taught us really how to be economists in a very specific way. So we had deep study of Marxist economics, very theoretical. We took classes with the likes of Don Katzner, where we spent 700 pages learning about the theory of a clock. It's an inside joke, but basically we had to memorize 700 pages of mathematical proofs to know that a demand curve, sloped downward. That course would have felt like a waste if I had to take Jim Crotty's class. So in that class, which was the sort of upper level macro class for PhD students, he brought together Marxian political economy, neoclassical economics, and showed us where it all fit together. His critique of the neoclassical synthesis, his bringing in of Keynes and Marx, Keynes, the institutionally specific, historically contingent version that some of you know so well. And really gave us a grounding in macro. And so a lot of us just went out and did whatever we're doing. We go to some state like Rhode Island, my friend McIntyre, myself, and in Maine, where you get to be a couple of things if you care about it and you feel like the legacy of the opportunity you had to learn at UMass could be applied some way to make the world a better place. So you get to be kind of a mini public intellectual. Many of us in our careers have been interviewed by the local press over a long period of time. And macro is the most kind of thing that comes up all the time. So I had the benefit of his grounding and real ability to speak in a way that journalists found interesting and insightful somehow or another about things that would come up, like the financial crisis of 2008 or banking crisis of the late 1980s or whatnot. And it was that class, and there was no class like it that really gave us that synthesis of that made us like a really an effective economist. And then I had the benefit, because I was friends with him and spent a lot of time with him, to continually update the knowledge that I got in 706 in the fall of 1981. He was always writing another brilliant paper on a new topic. We heard a lot about those this morning, and I read many, if not most of them. And then I'd get to talk to him about it for 2 or 3 days and get my update on that. So, just the sort of sophistication to be embedded in the labor movement, which is the big thing I do in Maine, or to speak to the press. And then finally, to teach a few hundred students each year how to think about the world. And so the version of macro, I taught intermediate macro for a long time, intro macro my whole career. I got to do Crotty economics. Even some of his articles were accessible to undergraduates. Some of you may know the JEI piece he published, I think, like in 1990 about level 1 and level 2. That was the Keynes had a historical understanding of things, and it was a great critique of neoclassical economics. And the heart of that story connects to something that he'd say, we know that Jim is very funny, right? That if he had just been a stand-up comic, could have given George Carlin a run for his money, including on dirty words, which he used frequently, with great aplomb. And one of the great things I loved about Pam is that, we knew that this was coming when he would start on a story or whatever, and he would say something a little bit filthy, and she would always blush and turn red and giggle like she is now. Like it was the first time she ever heard Jim utter such a word. And he was a conveyor belt of sort of witty potty mouth sort of humor. But anyway, so besides Pig Dog Meltzer, there was also Fred Schmutz. Does any of you remember Fred Schmutz? So Fred Schmutz was this proverbial conventional neoclassical economist who didn't understand the intellectual context of what's in a macro or micro textbook and just took it as faith. And we learned the critique of the neoclassical synthesis and why the general equilibrium theory wouldn't uphold, and all the ways in which financial fragility and institutions and ultimately class conflict and class power matters. And I would teach that in the class, to, again, dozens of students semester after semester, and they all knew who Fred Schmutz was, which meant that all the economics majors at USM up in Portland, Maine for decades knew that neoclassical economics was really represented not by, Paul Krugman or Paul Samuelson, but by Fred Schmutz, and with all the right connotations. So he was a wonderful resource in that. But the thing about Jim and Pam is that they just had this amazing expansiveness of their kindness and love and connection to people. And I know I'm talking about with his many friends that he collected over the years, but definitely his family. And we got to see all of that and got to know his family. Wonderful daughters, 7 grandsons and 1 granddaughter, and counting, or are we done? Okay. I just want to check in on that. They talked for a long time about, like, they have the most wonderful grandsons, and he spent time with all of them. Like, one of the things I never understood about Jim is how could he spend so much meaningful time with so many people, and yet he did, because he had that much energy and generosity of heart. So yeah, they were very excited after 7 grandsons to finally, so Lexi, that was a real mitzvah. Yeah. Okay. So my relationship with Pam and Jim. So they liked Maine. They loved Maine, and they loved to spend summers in Maine with their families. So all their kids and grandkids would come up. So they would stop at the outlets in Kittery, and I think he bought socks every year and Eddie Bauer shorts. Then they would stop at our house in Portland with Marcia and myself and stay for 2.5 days. And we did that probably like 20 times. And those are my favorite 3 days of the year because they just came and hung out with us. It was so much fun. And part of it helped is that my wife, Marcia Goldenberg, is a witty New York Jew. So there was a bit of like meeting of the minds culturally between the two of them, which means lots of humor. And so we had just all these like wonderful times together where we inquired about each other's lives and how our families were doing and always kept up with that. Jim and Pam were there for me through many hard times at certain points in my life, fearing of losing a job about 10 years ago, going through a tough divorce in the late 1980s. And I had people I could just call. I talked to you guys on the phone many, many times. I would come down and see them here in Amherst. Every time we came down to Amherst, had to stop by and see them and get to spend those 3 days in Portland every year. And so it was a mix of a lot of different things, continuing to be a student for all that time and learning more. Really just having a couple of people in my life who had all of this sort of wonder in having yet another friendship. And I think about the friends that you guys made in Buffalo, the friends that they made at Bucknell. I wish Steve Stamos isn't here, is he? I wish Stamos was here because I'm referred to him in a second. So, and then the friends that they made up here, and it seemed like there was just no shortage of energy and love for people because hanging out with Jim Crotty for him and for everybody else is the most fun thing to do. I mean, to do brilliant political economy and fight the caps class, that's all very important. But for them, the relationships of family and friends were just the kind of a cornerstone of their life and the energy that he brought to it. So just a few last little tidbits here. So in addition to Fred Schmutz and Pig Dog Meltzer, we had Stamos points. So Steve Stamos was a friend at Bucknell. And apparently, and Pam, you can correct me on this, but apparently like on Friday nights, they were young men at the time, like 35 or something like that. And they would go like play rugby and get bruises. And then they would go drink like 10 beers. And then they would challenge each other to go to the gym at 8 o'clock in the morning the next morning. And it's sort of a bravado sort of thing. So when they started coming up to Maine in the 80s, we had a version of that, which was to go into the cold Maine water at like 62 degrees. And the faster we could go in together, it was the two of us, and the deeper we could go, and the longer we could stay in, the more Stamos points that you got. So they would come for like 3 days, and we would compete to have the most Stamos points at the end. So you can see how much fun and energy we were just having the whole time. We had great dinners. I'm trying to remember the other pretty silly thing that he said. All right, I'm blanking on it, but I'll come back. So in the end, to sort of take in this conference, and the one that we did back in 2007, I was very happy to be tasked to be a co-editor and co-organizer of that conference of essays in honor of Jim that produced the book Heterodox Macroeconomics. It was a nice thing to do for him. I went up to Jerry this morning. I said, I hope you're publishing a second Festschrift, Festschrift being a book of essays in honor of somebody, because Jim deserves a second one. It's clear, like his legacy is just continuing to have this impact. And we could do a third one maybe in 10 years or so, because obviously the work goes on. But I think another legacy of him is just that he touched so many people's lives. He really cared about your success in life, your challenges, your struggles. And again, I bring Pam and Jim into this because they both really were like that. I mean, just so available and so willing to share the joy of life together. And the fact that I got to do it for almost 40 years would have been great to have another 10, obviously, for all of us. But those 40 years were really meaningful. So to conclude, My wife Marcia and I, like, this idea popped in her head about 20 years ago, that if we had ever won a lottery where you got to choose your parents, we said right to your face, Pam and Jim, you know, hands down, you'd be the parents we choose, because you guys are just, and I know things were a little bit easier with his friends than his kids. And I heard a lot of lore about that today, but I thought it wasn't worth sharing. So you can keep that in the family. But Pam had a health incident about 15 years ago. You went in the hospital, something went wrong. Things were a little touch and go. And the first thing I think he said when I saw him after that, you'd recovered and whatever, you're fine. Like, you're fine after it. But he just said, you know, people really need to understand Pam Crotty is a national institution and a national treasure. He said that. And that's how he thought about people that he cared and loved. So in the end, one of the few neoclassical concepts that I like is the idea of a public good, that one person's use of it does not exclude another. And Jim's love and Pam's love was a public good that they could share incredibly widely. And so I am so sad that I will not get to have another fun time with him, although I enjoy these online videos, and thanks to Arjun and those who put that together. Miss him very, very deeply, miss the times that we spent together. But boy, just what an incredible good fortune that I had, and many, many people in the room had, to be close to him, share the wonderful man that he was. So thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And Michael just gave Pam a picture of the in Maine, which maybe some of you can come up and look at sometime. I have a lot of people on the list, and so the next person I'm going to call is Eileen Grable. Is Eileen here?
Real privilege to be here, or be back up the podium again. I feel like the time spent since I was a student at UMass is measured by the prescription in my reading glasses, and how it increases every time I come back. And I speak with great sadness in memory of the passing of my dear friend, my mentor, my role model, Jim Crotty, from whom I learned so much. Jim's physical absence from the world, I think, makes it less just, less smart, less compassionate, less comprehensible, and less funny. A little bit about how I came to know Jim. I came to UMass in 1985 as a dedicated Marxist. I was committed to writing a dissertation on labor exploitation. That seemed like the thing for a young radical to do at that time. And Jim, and later along with Jerry, changed all of that. My time at UMass coincided with a really tumultuous time in the financial system and in the macroeconomy. And the passion and the knowledge with which Jim discussed all things macro, all things finance and political economy set me off on an entirely different course of study. I became obsessed with all things finance and remain so. And Jim's writing, teaching, and his mentorship really quite literally transformed my life. And I know that the same was true for generations of students who, like me, found a compassionate ear and a razor-sharp wit and intellect in that very cluttered, always welcoming office in the corner of Thompson Tower, since I'm from the old days. And I think Jim managed to mess up the prime office that he later came to occupy in the beautiful Crotty Hall that was named for his and Pam's role in the development of radical political economy and IRPI's founding. I'll never forget the times I spent with Jim and Pam over wonderfully warm dinners at their home on Potwine Lane. Similarly, I'll never forget all the time I spent learning from Jim in the classroom during the years when I was working on my dissertation under his and Jerry's direction, and then all that I continued to learn from Jim in the decades since I left UMass. I can still picture Jim and Pam's Potwine Lane living room, clear as day. I spent a lot of time there with Jim, drinking tea, playing with their dog, and talking with Jim about the agonizing process that was my dissertation. And with his excellent example, imagining myself as a future professor, talking with my own students. And the latter is something I never would have expected, given that, like Jim, I was working class person, a first generation college graduate, and from the very rough parts of the metro New York metropolitan area. And Jim's patience with me was really infinite and incredibly important. He always made me feel like I was the most important person in the room. And he always had infinite time for me. And he always assured me that we would get through my dissertation, despite my own doubts about that on many occasions. And for those of us that are not from academic or even from professional families, Jim's lived experience and his empathy were really life-preserving for me. Having Jim in my court and in my head helped me every day to work, to do better work, and ultimately to build a life and a career that I love. And that red pen, which I can see now still, but always yielded with such love, such wit, and of course with keen insight. I strive all the time to think about what Jim would say and do when I'm struggling with a writing project, when I'm navigating academic politics in my own department, when I'm working with my students, or when I'm trying to make sense of this ugly world. I also think very often about the things he said to me, and about the example he set without ever calling attention to himself as a mentor and a role model. That was definitely not his style. I'll never be 10% as kind, as smart, or as good as Jim in any respect, but his example continues to challenge me to always do better. I also often think about his many quips and his funny asides. He'll always be the great, brilliant, kind person in the light blue Oxford shirt, the tan chinos, and metal rim glasses. And I know how much he enjoyed telling the story about being asked by someone, and I'm 99% sure it was Jack Ameriglio that asked him this, if he owned only one shirt and one pair of pants, or if he had a closet full of identical outfits. Jim talked about that quite a lot. And I remember from my experience in Macro 706, the demand and the supply curves that chased each other off the boards. I remember as well a conference at UMass when quite a famous discussant from the BIS, if I'm recalling correctly, was asked to discuss a paper after Jim presented it. And this BIS economist really aggressively criticized Jim's paper. And then Jim, when it came time for him to respond, he began his response by saying with his great smile, "I'm really glad that so-and-so liked my paper so much." And then he paused to chuckle. He gave that great wry smile, and he proceeded to really destroy the discussant without a trace of malice in his voice. And I think it was Robert Macaulay, if I'm remembering correctly. I also remember his many stories about his experiences at Carnegie Mellon. And of course, as several people have noted, he had a lot to say about Alan Meltzer. I remember as well his experiences with the nuns as a boy at Catholic school in the Bronx, his time as a rugby player, his reflections on his parents, and his feelings about academics who had tread an easier path than he had, having when they were born to professional families. And I remember as well his funny and brilliant reflections about just about everything else. He was a really great talker, as I know we all know. But unlike many people who are great talkers, he was also a great listener. I remember in particular when he picked up the phone when we were long into the age of texting and emailing, to find out how my husband, George, also a former karate student, how he was doing after a health crisis that we were facing. And above all, I remember how much Jim really got me and how much it meant to me that he really got me when I struggled to feel like I belonged in graduate school and that I belonged in academia. I still remember how wonderful it was to mark the release of his monumental Keynes book in Washington, D.C., even though Jim's health prevented him from going to that event. I have equally fond memories around the release of the book that contained many of his collected papers during the Great Karate Hall celebration and his wonderful retirement party, where he gave a true tour de force, kind of classic karate speech. And certainly Jim continued to write and write brilliantly well beyond that time. I also remember very well the time that Jim and Pam stayed at our home in Denver. That visit meant a lot to me. And I recall that when Jim saw my home office, he said, "It looks like you could perform surgery in here." He was not wrong. Pam and I both share a great commitment to anti-clutter. So Jim was quite right. And of course, that was horrific to him because he was a real clutter maven. I also just want to note, just in closing, that I know we're all here to celebrate Jim and to remember him. His work lives on in many ways through his former students, his colleagues in the department and around the world, including in Japan and South Korea, where he had a huge community of colleagues and friends, and through the intellectual traditions that Jim helped to build. I miss him dearly, and I always will, and I know we all will. Thank you.
Thank you, Eileen. Now let's call David Kotz.
This is a little bit of a shift of gears. I joined the UMass Econ faculty in 1978, a few years after Jim Crotty had come here. And I initially taught U.S. economic history, industrial organization. Later, when we introduced a new course in Marxist political economy, course in crisis theory, and a course in socialist economies. Jim made major contributions and had a major impact on radical political economics / heterodox economics, as many people have pointed out. However, I would like to honor Jim's methodology by taking account of the milieu, the context in which Jim came to be who he was, the early period of Jim's time here. I believe Jim was right that we need a macro foundation of micro, and I'll try to apply that to Jim. Jim in the late 60s and early 70s was part of a particular social context, and that formed his initial trajectory together with his own personal features. Before I came to UMass in 1978, I met Jim through Ray Bodie. I was teaching then at American University in Washington. Before deciding whether to come to UMass, I spoke at length on the phone with Jim Crotty. So even before I came here, I got the long phone conversation with Jim. He encouraged me to come. I had met Jim through Ray Bodie, and I decided he was right. I couldn't resist what everyone viewed as the leading place for a Marxist economist in the U.S. At that time, the so-called radicals who came to UMass in the 70s, who joined the faculty, were produced by the upheavals around the protests against racial segregation and the Vietnam War, the beating of Black protesters, the napalming of people in Vietnam. This profoundly affected a whole generation in the late 60s and early 70s, particularly college students. And we were determined to understand capitalism and why it was producing racial segregation and war and violence. We found the mainstream economics of the day, which, by the way, was Keynesian, although with a strong neoclassical microdose. We found it inadequate to explain why these things were happening. And we decided to read Marx with an open mind, and many of us participated in a study group for a year reading the 3 volumes of Marx's Capital. We read it critically, we asked questions, but at many graduate programs around the US at that time, particularly Harvard, Yale, MIT, Michigan, and Berkeley, many of the econ grad students who participated in this became convinced that the Marxist approach offered the best way to understand capitalism and the problems that it produced. When I came to UMass, the PhD students came from the same generation. I mean, the radicals, we were all in our early to mid 30s. We weren't much older than the graduate students. They were from the same movement. We played basketball with them. As has been noted, Jim was the best of the basketball players at that time. Michael Best was a close second. And despite myself having played 3 years of varsity high school basketball, I was a distant third in that category. We were influenced by the cultural norms of that movement: anti-hierarchy, informality, equality, taking everyone's contribution as valuable. Jim's commitment to understanding capitalism and its possible alternatives, along with his respectful treatment of students, was both a product of Jim's own personality and the period, the movement of which he was part. Everyone has mentioned Jim's humor. I will mention the remarkable conversation I had with him when I visited UMass for my job market talk, a moment of great pressure on anyone who's in the job market. It was in March or April of 1978. And either before or after my job talk, I don't remember exactly when, I was talking with Jim Crotty in the halls of Thompson Power. And I asked Jim, because I'd heard some stories, what are the relations between the radical faculty and the graduate students here? I'd heard some stories, I wondered. And Jim looked at me and he said, it's like this. And he opened his eyes wide. He said, what's that sound? I think I hear drums. It must be the graduate students calling a meeting. A perfect imitation of the British colonialist in Africa, terrified of the impending uprising of the oppressed local people. It turned out not to be that far off. Jim was also famous. He didn't just teach graduate macro. I mean, I was his colleague for those years. I was his colleague, comrade, and friend. He also taught undergraduate Marxian economics. And I heard from graduate student friends that when the lecture came about chapter 15 of volume 1 of Capital about machinery and modern industry, where Marx recounted at great length the incredibly oppressive conditions that working people faced in England in that period of industrialization, of the introduction of machinery, not the current period he was writing, but a bit earlier, the late 1700s, early 1800s, 12, 16-hour workdays, etc. Jim would be lecturing to the undergraduates. He'd be telling them about it, facing the class, and then he would turn around to write on the board wearing his red T-shirt, and on the back was emblazoned, "We love you, Leonard Horner." Who was Leonard Horner? He was the leading Factory Act inspector in England who gave Marx numerous examples of the extreme mistreatment of workers in that period. So Jim showed both his deep sympathy for working people being screwed and his remarkable sense of humor in presenting it at the same time. Karl Marx showed a tendency to go on at remarkable length about any point he thought was important. Anyone who's read Marx's Capital learns this. Marx saw more sides to every question than most of us would see, and he covered every one of them. And I've always believed that what Jim did to his students, graduate students' papers, the red marks that when you added them up, they were probably longer than the paper itself. I suspected he was influenced by Marx in that respect, believing that's how you write. You don't let anything pass by. You comment on it, pro or con, but Jim always did it supportively. Finally, the 1960s and 70s did have its downside. In that period, unfortunately, it was marked by frequent vicious personal attacks by newly minted Marxist economists in the US and the UK, not against their alleged class enemies, but against other Marxist economists who had a somewhat different interpretation of the labor theory of value or the main cause of crisis. There were a lot of very harsh polemics. And Jim never stooped to that. He always made a case for his view. He made it calmly, and I thought very convincingly. His paper about the political business cycle was a wonderful example of applying a concept from chapter 25 of volume 1 of Marx about how changes in workers' bargaining power over the business cycle could affect the way the economy proceeded. And together with Ray Bodie, they used empirical data to make a case that this actually shows up in the US economy in the 1950s and 60s. It was a wonderful intervention. So in that period, he was really working very much from a Marxist perspective, but like all of us, he did evolve over time and began to introduce more elements of Keynes in his work. But he always worked from the same basis of trying to do analyses that took account of the way the world actually worked, looked at empirical evidence, paid attention to Marx, Keynes, and other great theories to help us understand capitalism and how it can be overcome and what it can be replaced by. Thank you.
Brenda Wiss. Brenda, are you here?
Hi, everyone. I'm actually going to do two. I'm first going to read some thoughts from my husband, Barry Shelley, who was a graduate student here, and he couldn't be here today, but he will be here tomorrow. Barry says, "There's much I could say about Jim, and I'm sure that those gathered here will speak of his many attributes, along with some hilarious stories. I'll just limit my brief remarks to one such attribute, one that I especially remember and appreciate. Jim Crotty was a kind person. In my experience, he treated others, perhaps most notably his students, with respect and care. I began my graduate studies in the economics department in the spring semester 1996, so I wasn't able to follow the usual sequence of foundational courses. While there were definitely disadvantages to my starting point, one advantage was that in my first semester, I was able to take a new seminar on globalization that Jerry and Jim were teaching for the first time. Despite the fact that most students in the course were more advanced in economics training than I was, both Jim and Jerry welcomed me, given my circumstances, and engaged in substantive ways with my contributions to discussions, which were primarily rooted in my international experience in Central America. I've always been grateful that I had such a great entry point into graduate school, not just intellectually stimulating and relevant, but warm and welcoming as well. I took other courses from Jim and enjoyed engaging with him informally around the department. I was fond of many economics faculty members, but Jim was one of my favorites. It was always a pleasure to see him, whether in the elevator or at a post-seminar dinner. and he always seemed genuinely interested in how I and others were doing. As I said, Jim Crotty was a kind person. So those are thoughts from my husband, Barry Shelley. And then I actually thought Jerry told me I could talk for 1 to 2 minutes. And so I'm really going to do that. So yeah, I would say I have a wealth of affection for Jim, even though the range and the depth of my interactions with him was fairly limited. So when I was a graduate student in the mid 1980s, I took just one course with Jim. And that's the course many people have referred to it. We called it Macro 2. I'm no macroeconomist, although I was really happy to notice that I remembered more than I thought I might from the class that I took with him. But what I really remember from that semester was how much Jim seemed to enjoy teaching and how infectious that was. My most vivid memory of Jim in the classroom was how much he appreciated his own sense of humor. Yes. So he would crack a joke and then he would just laugh and laugh at himself. And a lot of times I didn't understand the meaning of the joke, but I would laugh at Jim laughing at himself. And I've really tried to carry some of that kind of delight into my own teaching, to enjoy teaching, because I feel like if the professor isn't even enjoying it, how are the students going to? And the other fond memory I was thinking of was when Jim generously came to Wheaton College, where I teach, and he did a lecture for our students. This was probably mid 1990s. And I just remember he gave a talk that was really, really fascinating. He was so patient with student and faculty questions. He came to a leisurely dinner with colleagues and students. And as always, he was incredibly engaging and down to earth. I was a pretty new faculty member at that time, but I do remember feeling so proud of being a graduate of the UMass Econ department. Thank you.
Thank you. Michelle Naples?
Just a few stories. I came in 76, and I think Jim was charged with being the exo liaison or something. So there was some drama one night after a meeting or during a meeting, and I don't know who called him, but he showed up. It was someone's birthday, and he had left the family party early to get to the department to try to help avert the crisis, and then discovered how much ad hominem stuff was going on and was a little frustrated. He shared with me a referee report he was doing for an article by an economist I won't name, but it was an article he really thought was wrongheaded and had missed the Reserve Army argument and misapprehended it. And he went back and forth, we talked about it and he went back and forth with the economist, and the guy moved to a really different position and is now given recognition for his contribution to the Reserve Army argument, which was really all crotty. Well, from my point of view, it was really crotty. I have other particular, personal stories, like he kept me from being fired. When I first started teaching, I had a year and then they wanted me to be done and it was taking longer. And so he just went to bat that, she's going to defend in whatever it was, January, someone's out of the country, and which wasn't quite true. And it got me the year I needed to finish. I wanted to say I also grew up Catholic, and he shared with me, and maybe it's going to come out later, but that part of what happened when he was working with the nuns was that he participated with them in writing up some social principles for, I forget who, Catholic bishops, it's a conference in the United States. And I had been aware of those principles that were very progressive, like, yeah, I wrote them, like, that he participated in writing them. So God bless him. I just wanted also to say that like his ongoing attention to crisis really and details, like what happened in 2008, really inspired me to end up running the Fed Challenge at my school to try to get the students to pay attention to the present as history and to try to make sense of it. Not so much that I hope you'll go work for the Fed someday, but that you'll hope, you'll understand the work. So yeah, he stands, he stands. I'm sorry. I miss him. I'm sorry I haven't sent a card yet with condolences because I miss him and I felt so sad to hear it. But his work's.
John Goldstein?
Well, I will also stick to the 1 to 2 minutes. And a couple of the speakers already have kind of given me permission to say some of the couple of things I want to say. But I worked with Jim as my dissertation advisor in the mid to late 80s. And if I had, I briefly thought about contributing an article to the RRPE tribute issue. I was going to entitle it Jim Crotty, Microeconomist, because he was so into trying to suss out the decision making that was going on, especially in the financial markets, which, as Eileen pointed out, was a tumultuous time in the 80s. Jim was a voracious reader of all the financial press. For years after I left UMass, I always had a sub to the Wall Street Journal because Jim would tell me, you have to find out what these people are thinking about. You have to find out what they're doing. You have to read the little articles about some bond that crashed somewhere and what happened to the various players. He always encouraged me to read about that kind of stuff, anything that would help me understand that stuff. You have to be reading Kahneman and Tversky. Nobody was talking about Kahneman and Tversky in the UMass Econ department, but Jim was clued into what they were doing and thinking about it. But unlike them, I think he was always tying it into and trying to relate it to the institutional developments within which these things happen. So that was quite formative. The one incident that I remember very clearly, and I'll just end by mentioning this, was in October of 1987. I don't remember the date, but the stock market massively crashed. I was working on a dissertation on the effect of stock market speculation and changes on hostile corporate takeovers. And Jim was very supportive of that. And I had not heard anything about the stock market crash because, you know, in those days you weren't always looking at this and up on everything that was going on in the world. So I went into his office just to touch base, and he said, "See, the stock market fell, 1,000 points today." I said, "No, you're kidding me." He said, "Yeah, unbelievable." He said, "But that's good for you." He said, "Because you are in the fucking motherlode now, baby." And it was true. Thanks.
Leonsin Dukumana.
Okay, so some people gave up their time, so I'm going to take all that. Sounds fair. So Leonsin Dukumana again. Greetings, Pam. Greetings from Gaudence. Thanks all her cards. So I'll quickly talk about quickly with all the time accumulated about Jim. First, that I know as an admired macroeconomist. I was doing my graduate work too under Larry. But then as a mentor when I came here, a senior colleague, and then a friend and trusted advisor. So Jim hired me. It was in San Francisco where I did my interview, and I had known Jim Crotty as an economist studying under Steve Vassari because they had endless discussions about which theory of investment is Keynesian. And everybody thought, each one thought that they had the right investment theory that was consistent with Keynes. So I knew about Jim, and then when I was invited I was terrified that I may meet Jim Crowley. I did in San Francisco. First of all, because he was chair of the committee, the one who introduced himself to me, and I said, I could feel I'm dead. Impossible. Imposing, first of all, physically imposing, and then already in my head posing. So large macroeconomist. But by the end of the interview, I kept waiting for this terrifying figure. It didn't come. So I realized this is such a humble person. I couldn't believe it. Because many times, again, in the same, you would go in some rooms for interview and you really feel they don't want you. Because they're so rude, they don't even let you talk. And yeah, say, why did you call me? You don't want to talk. But Jim was very nice. I was very pleased with the meetings, and then eventually got invited to come. So once I got at UMass, because I had been hired to macro, Doug Vickers was retiring, so I went to take over. Again, knowing that I was from the broader Keynesian tradition, but from new Keynesian macro, but also from trained by the Fazari, with whom they could never agree which theory was right. So, but Jim was my mentor and continued to be, so he took over from Steve to teach me macro. But what I realized is that he never tried to mold me in his own thinking. He supported me in doing the work I was. And talking of red pen, when I submitted my first paper from my dissertation, a paper I had worked on for a long time, presented here, and the places came back with a referee report from the Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics. I was crushed. After 2 days, I received the letter. It came as a letter, not as an email. And I put it aside for 2 days because I was terrified of opening it. When I opened it, I was disappointed. So I came to Jim and said, very disappointed, the paper wasn't accepted. They can I look at it, looked at it. Wow, congratulations. I said, what are you talking about? He said, does it say this paper is rejected? I said, no. So we sat down, and then by the time we were done, I had some idea about how to advise it. So it got published. But the point about me knowing him, studying under Fazari, and him mentoring me as me, I want to emphasize the fact that, again, as I've said, Jim was a very kind, but also a very honest intellectual. Even though he did not agree with what you said, he actually told you what it means. He showed you that he understood but he didn't say, unless you change it, I'm not going to read it. And this, but he let you do things the way you want. The other thing that really marked me as Jim, as I'm having the approach to mentoring is, again, I was hired as a macroeconomist. I was supposed to take macro or take over macro. But the first day when I was visiting for interview, at the end of the dinner, he accompanied me to the hotel. It was still the campus center hotel. He said, I know you have some interest in economic development, and we have a very strong development here. There was Jim Boyce, Carmen here, Mohan. And he said, okay, you can mix and match, do macro, do development. Because that was my concern. Because I say, what are they going to think if they realize I may have interest in development because they're hiring me for macro? I said, once again, the kind of person who is there, almost there for you, even though you have to, it's as if you're competing with them, but they actually on your team. I couldn't understand it. Then back to the 2-page ink of comments on my paper. I think as a teacher, what we do not and appreciate many times, by myself too, is the distance that exists between you as a or as a senior faculty and a junior faculty. So the way you come across in terms of the way you put out, give your comments is extremely. I still remember how relieved I was when I left. Even though his comments were really, really rigorous, I didn't know how I'm going to address them, but at least the way he gave them to me was reassuring that doable, he can do it. I mean, published. So I will always try to emulate it. I don't think I can do it, but that was a very good model for me as a then as a family friend. When we came here again, this was new to for us. We're coming from the Midwest, but I think one of the things again people were saying about they share, but with Jim is again. And now I realize later on, I realized maybe we shared the fact that we both came from humble background, but also did not apologize. He did not apologize. No, he was proud of being a humble background and also proud of having succeeded. And to me, I never think of myself of being from a poor background. No, I'm not. A humble background. And I really appreciated the dinners we had and how the kids were so happy playing in your room and messing up your living room, your books and so on. So what I will remember always and appreciate with my experience with Jim is my relationship with him as a mentor, which was really my relationship. Taught me a lot. My being lucky to be in the same neighborhood. Every time I walk on Pomeroy Lane, you guys are in that house. Always be your house for me. And again, the idea that doesn't matter how far you come from, where you come from, what's your background, it's all about what you want. And always respect everyone, regardless where they are, where they come from, how big or tall they are. Thanks.
Now I'd like to ask Tom Rydell, who's an old friend of Jim and Pam's, professor of economics at Smith College. I think you're a dean again or something. I'm sorry about that. And for many years, the director of the Center for Popular Economics. So Tom Rydell.
Hi, everybody. I knew Jim first in 1973. Jim had two momentous impacts on my career as an economist and as an educator. The first of which in 1973, I was a graduate student at American University. Hi, Ray. And Jim was very instrumental in my getting my first full-time teaching job at Bucknell. He was there. He'd been there for, I think, a year, maybe 2 years, when Ray was also instrumental. They produced a very good paper, but they also produced my ability to have higher education as my career. Ray suggested to Jim that I was in the market. I was in the market. It was a 1-year job, but at that point, it was what was available. And it turned into a few more years after that. It was also the only year that Jim and I overlapped at Bucknell, because he ended up coming to UMass. The year that we were together at Bucknell, Jim was a colleague, a more experienced colleague than I was. I was kind of a rookie. I spent innumerable hours in his office talking about being a professor, mostly about teaching, occasionally about the substance of the work. At that time, I still hadn't finished my dissertation, and so he was helpful in that regard, encouraging me to keep at it and talking about the substance of what I wrote about, which was basically the political economy of the war in Vietnam, its costs, consequences, and contradictions. The other fond memories I have of the time that we shared at Bucknell were Jim's sharing of his family. I spent a lot of time at their apartment in, what was it, Faculty Court. Yeah. A lot of singing, a lot of watching children run around the house, a lot of appreciating what a family was like, and that you could have a job and you could still have a family and have a different kind of life. It probably had something to do with the fact that I also reproduced and had children. Like Michael, I've had 2 families. I have 2 sons by natural mechanisms and 4 sons by a later merger. And so I guess I was so inspired, I ended up with even more than Jim and Pam had. So that was one momentous occasion. The second was after Jim had been here for a while, he was instrumental in my being invited to be a visiting professor at UMass. And I did that for 2 years, from 1978 to 1980. And this is my version of this story, but so I'll go ahead and tell it because, you know, I'm the source for this side of the story. There was an expression of interest in my visiting for a 3rd year because I didn't really want to go back to Bucknell. It was okay, but being here, part of the reason for coming here to visit in the first place was that my family wanted to live in New England. And so we were here. I visited for 2 years. I taught a lot of classes. I enjoyed it. Spent a lot of time in Jim's office talking about teaching and talking about family and talking about other things. And there was an expression that I could do it for a 3rd year. And I don't know who it was, but one of the deans said, no, you can't do that because if he's here for a 3rd year, he can join the union. I don't know whether that's true or not, but that's sort of what happened. And then I made a decision that I wasn't going to go back to Bucknell. They gave me a 2nd year's leave of absence, and I started looking around, and I ended up getting a job at Smith. Jim was very supportive in that regard. Again, it was another one-year job that turned into a much longer stint. About half the time I was at Smith, I was in the economics department. And the last half of it, I was a class dean. And I think that Jim's connection to that, as a number of people have pointed out, he was at heart an educator. He was a very smart economist and he did a lot of really good work, but at heart, he was an educator. He was a teacher. And I shared that commitment. And so what I've ended up doing in my career is kind of a broader kind of teaching than about a particular subject matter. I'm going to end with a story. Channeling Jim, it might not be short. I'll try to keep it short. As people have pointed out, Jim was also an athlete. He played basketball, he played rugby. In the 80s, he turned in a slightly different direction. I think seeing the writing on the wall because he knew his basketball career and his rugby career were probably limited and possibly over. So much to my surprise, Jim decided that he wanted to play golf. So he started golfing, and he and I were frequent partners. As Don Mychek pointed out earlier, a lot of the time it was the three of us, frequently joined by one of my sons who I had cleverly taught to play golf so that I could do child care while I got to amuse myself playing golf. Jim played regularly. He enjoyed the golf. He enjoyed the company of friends. But it won't surprise you to hear that he had a particular approach to the game of golf. Fundamentally, golf is about hitting a round object with a flat object. There are a lot of different things that can happen when they have an impact. The goal is to hit it straight from where you start and then keep hitting it straight until you get to the place where the ball's supposed to go in the hole. Large numbers of occasions when you played golf with Jim, he'd get on the first tee. For example, he would hit the ball to the left. And he would make note of that. As you all know, Jim was consistently committed to empirical evidence. And then on the second tee, the same thing would happen. He would hit it to the left. Now, it's appropriate, I suppose, that he hits it to the left rather than hitting to the right. But mostly he hit it to the left. And he would look at Don and I. He would look at Don and me. And he would say, I must be doing something wrong. So linking the empirical evidence to a particular conclusion. And then, as you all know, Jim would not stop there. He had an avid dedication to an analytical approach. He would subsequently try to figure out why he was hitting it to the left. And so for the next several holes, possibly even through the entire round, Jim would say, it must be my wrists. No, I think it's my shoulder. Maybe it's the way I'm aiming. And he would just incessantly, it would drive Don and I mad. But we would just sort of giggle and say, yep, must be that. Well, maybe it's this. One of the things that will help Jim live on is that Don and I now are continuing to be golf partners. And whenever I make a mistake, I always say to Don, I must be doing something wrong. That's usually where I stop, although I repeat it a lot. And then one last story, because other people have also channeled Jim. Jim had a lot of Korean friends that he played golf with, one of whom, as he was headed back towards South Korea, Jim and he were playing golf, and he said, "Now I understand golf in America. You hit the ball and say, fuck."
Ellen Russell.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ellen Russell. And in my opinion, I've only ever had one conversation with Jim Crotty. And it began, I'm thinking 1997. And I'm still at it, even if I'm just talking solo. But it started in macro. He had just been to Japan. He was like over the moon about canes and all this. And I was just sort of trying to follow the plot. And he has read Shackle, so which is to say, like fundamental uncertainty and la-di-da. And I thought, oh, wow, that's fascinating. And then we read Keynes. And what I get from this is, okay, so we have no knowledge about these things that are fundamentally uncertain. I know I have no knowledge. I trust that then your knowledge, like other people, must know what I don't know. And in my aspiration to be rational, I trust them. But implicitly, I know they don't know because I'm judging how confident I am in their judgment. And I stopped. Like that was the end of macro for me, because I was like, where are we going with this? Because like, other than psychoanalysis, I'm not really sure how to manage this new vista of macroeconomics. So over the next decades, really, I had the occasional email or conversation, which this was just still bugging me, and I couldn't deal with. I had no resolution. So about 5 or 7 years ago, I emailed him and said, like, okay, I still have to handle this. And I gave him my ideas, and he supported me pursuing them. And in the end, I did write an article that was my attempt to handle this problem. And I had gone to him saying, you know, I've been kind of having this conversation with you in my imagination for all of these now decades. And he supported me, even though his health was really failing. And it was quite generous of him to even write me a few lines saying, yeah, keep at it. And at the very last email I got from Jim was, well, I'm glad you think I'm such a good teacher, ... in your imagination.
By the way, Alan will be presenting this paper tomorrow. Oscar, come to attention.
I'm gonna stick with 2 minutes too. I didn't really prepare a conversation, talk, but a couple of anecdotes. The red pen. I mean, we're all saying good things about the red pen and harsh criticisms and everything on those papers. And every now and then, you know, you get your paper back, you know, it's like crossed out and, you know, this is wrong and you got to do this and this, that. And then, exactly. And then every now and then, there would be like a paragraph, a few sentences where, you know, he would underline and there would be a smiling face next to it. This is before the smileys, right? You know, before the cell phones, whatever. But, you know, a red sort of happy face, you know, and to this day, I am very much sure that those happy smiling faces were drawn by Pam after Jim went to bed. Do you know? And one anecdote, like this building was opened in my last couple of years here, and me and Arjun had an office downstairs, like the very first office when you enter the building. And then there was a printer in the building, which was right above our office. And, this is 2004 or 5 or something like that. And the printers were really slow. So I finished a draft of a chapter. And before sending it to Jim, I wanted to print it out and read it, just to make sure that, didn't make, like any big mistakes or whatever, something like that. So I sent it to the printer. The printer is really slow. And I went out, sat on one of those benches, smoking a cigarette, waiting for the printer to finish. I finished my cigarette. I walked upstairs. The printer is still, papers are coming out. And there is Jim with his red pen standing in front of the printer. I was like, no, this is not. So that was like instant feedback, as the stuff is coming out of. And then after I went back to Turkey, after I moved back to Istanbul, I invited a whole bunch of people. Jerry came and David came and Jim. I wanted Jim and Pam to come, and that Pam wasn't able then, but Jim came and stayed with me for about a week or so. And that's where I actually sort of like understood. I mean, I didn't know anything about Bronx or whatever. He talked about it all the time. I was like, when his paper was like the top paper, he would just be like, well, not bad for a kid from Bronx. And, he'd go like that. But I didn't really, I didn't know New York much, right? So I didn't know what Bronx meant. And for those of you who know like the small streets in Istanbul and the cars and people pushing it, and we were walking with Jim, and Jim was like, he was like old by then. And I was like, hey, now I see it. He's from Bronx. And, you take him out of Bronx, you take him all the way to Istanbul, but, he takes Bronx with him. And the last thing I kind of like want to say is that I had to stop going to the gym because of Jim. Because when I was in grad school, I started going to a gym to exercise and stuff, like right on the way to Potwine Lane. And, I'm just like, either like, running on the treadmill or like playing with the weights. And then I hear this, no, you got to run faster. And it's Jim. I ended up going to his gym of all the places. And, the red pen was still there in terms of like the weights or whatever. And so I really miss him. And I know I'm going to miss him for the rest of my life. But I also feel really lucky to have known him and to have spent some time with him. So thank you for doing this.
Thank you, Oscar. Is Elaine McCrate here? Elaine, you're up. So good to see you.
Well, I think I'm in a distinct minority here because I am not a macroeconomist. And one way of attesting to Jim and Pam's extraordinary generosity with their time and their spirit is that they opened up their home to me just like they would to any macroeconomist. I didn't know, I don't know what Jim was where. I have some idea, but I don't know why we clicked originally. I think it may have been over our Irish Catholic working class background. I know we both swore like sailors. And I also talked to June Lapidus, who is another old UMass grad student from my era of my vintage. And she said that one of the things she will always remember, and that I think I'll also remember, is that he made it UMass feel like it was a place for working class kids. There were many times when I wasn't really sure about it, and she wasn't really sure about it either. And we just felt like we belonged. And The last thing I would say is that it was about Jim's approach to trying to keep hope in a world that's, quickly going to hell. And, and he had a message of don't ever give up, but it was really a message of very pragmatic hope. And he just said, we all put our own little paddles in the water and we just paddle like hell. And that's what he did. And that's what he taught the rest of us to do. And that's what we need to keep on doing for Jim. Thank you.
July and June might still be online. Is Rick McIntyre here?
Very interesting listening to all these stories because really, I usually don't need it. Oh, for the audience. Okay. How lucky are we? Right? How lucky are we? We are lucky. I met Jim in 1981 in that famous Macro 2 class. And I said, this guy is funny, smart, wicked smart, and interesting. And I actually had no interest in Keynes whatsoever. I was just not interested at all. But he was also tough. And the tough part I learned because he was chair. And our class, on one of those times where the drums were beating in Thompson Tower, decided we were going to go in and tell the faculty how we wanted the comprehensive exams organized. And for reasons I'll leave to your imagination, Hillard and I were nominated to go in and do the negotiating. And we went in and look at that face, right? There's a smile, but the eyes, right? And basically, Crotty said, no way. It's not even a conversation. We're not even going to talk about this. If you don't take the exams the way we lay them out, you're out of the program. Oh, I thought this guy was my friend. And he was very clear about where things stood. And at that time, I intended to write a dissertation with Leonard Rapping, who some of you knew. Leonard had a Friday morning seminar called International and Domestic Economic Restructuring. And that was just what I was interested in. I loved that seminar. It was great. I met people like Jerry, who presented a paper with Tom Ferguson. You may not remember that, but you did. It was a great paper. And Ira Magaziner and Jamie Galbraith and Michael Moffat and a whole bunch of people. And I was in. And then the beginning of my third year, I was a TA for Leonard. And those of you who knew Leonard, knew he was a little difficult. And I decided that maybe this wasn't for me. And Jim encouraged me to try to stick it out because Jim had his own complicated relationship with Leonard. But I was getting interested in other things. McCloskey's paper on rhetoric had just begun to circulate. And I had taken a course with Rick Wolf on Marx. And I thought this was the way I wanted to go. And yet Jim, who could not convince me to go down the particular road I had been going down, remained very friendly to me. I was part of that group, that study group that dealt with the paper that Bob Poland was talking about earlier, the Marx and Finance paper. We met at Pam and Jim's house to talk about it on Potwine Lane. I always thought that was a joke, They have that now, pot wine. And where was that 40 years ago when I really could have used it, In any case, Jim and I remained friends. We would meet at conferences. We would have meals together, oftentimes with Hillard. I met Michael in that Macro 2 course, and Jim encouraged us to write together. And we've been writing together ever since. So it was a remarkable gift to Michael and I. I would call him now and then with questions that I had, and we would have long phone conversation. about Keynes' changing views or unchanging views on exchange rates, about the relationship between Marx and Keynes, all kinds of things. And it was a gift to me to be able to have those conversations. This is the third Karate Fest, if my calculations are correct. It was Karate Fest 1 when he retired. And I gave a paper that Michael and I had written, which was a critique of the idea of the capital labor accord, which most people in IRPI at that time thought was gospel. And it was kind of a shaky thing for us to do. And I gave the paper and I could see steam coming out of the ears of some people. But after that, after I gave it, I had lunch with Karate. And he said, you know, I didn't like the paper very much, but you delivered it beautifully. And you know, from an Irish American storyteller, one Irish American storyteller to another, I thought that was pretty good. And then at Karate Fest 2, when we had that the reception down at Lord Poison Blankets hotel down here, and I met Jim at the cocktail hour, and we talked, and I knew he was, you know, struggling a little bit with the book. And so I said to him, listen, Jim, you know, I edit for Routledge. I've been doing a lot of editing. If you need another set of eyes to look at the book, I'm happy to do it. And he nodded like, you know, that'll never happen. And a few months later, he emailed me and he said, would you read the book and give me some feedback? And so I did. I mean, I read this thing so carefully in such detail. And I gave him a whole slew of comments, corrections, etc. And this is the tough part now, right? And he said to me, he said, well, you're a really great copy editor, but I'm not changing anything of substance whatsoever. And so, you know, he remained that person that I met in 1981. And I had the same experience as Eileen did. I'm a first generation college student. I think that brought it working class, Catholic, all that stuff. So, you know, just one thing, Eileen, it was Pig Dog Meltzer. Remember that? And we all thought that these Chicago people at that time were pigs. David might have said that once in a while, but I can't remember any other faculty who would say Pig Dog Meltzer. Wow. So last, I mean, one of the reasons that the many reasons I admired Jim was because he was a family man and he had kids. And my youngest daughter, who's 37, just found out last year that Fred Schmutz is not a real person. I have, as I told Jerry, my daughter just had another child. I have 10 grandchildren. It's not a competition, right? But the youngest one, the second one, and number 2, is now a freshman here at UMass. So it's all come around. So thank you for sharing Jim with us, and thank you for giving me this time.
Yes, and want to thank Rick for the role that he played in making sure that Jim's book got published. So thank you. Is Geert here? Okay.
I'm really happy we're having this. I want to thank Jerry and Bob for putting this together because it's so nice to listen to the papers here and be here and all these various stories over, you know, all these decades he was here. You know, I think it's important to have these things because it's like, though, you know, when somebody dies and they're gone and, you know, those of us that's left alive still, you know, miss them because we love them. And, you know, it's a good way to think about these things. And so I don't want to talk for 2 hours, but I just want to tell a couple different stories and maybe it'll be 2 hours. First, it's like since that Rethinking Marxism book has been brought up so many times already with the 1985 article, it's before I came to UMass, I was active in the anti-globalization movement as an activist and with various kind of, associated with various, revolving around various kind of anarchist publishers and publications and so on. So I was trying to figure out about like, how the fuck is this world working here? Or what are these things work? How to understand these different things? I often came across various UMass professors or references to UMass. So I was like, I gotta figure this out. So I guess I should go to UMass and get a PhD. Maybe I finish it or not, whatever, I don't even care. It's like, let me go for a couple of years and learn these things. But reading some of those things before about UMass, I remember reading David Kotz in like Z Magazine. But one of the things that I came across with very easily, it was very easily available, was this Rethinking Marxism book published by Autonomedia. So, struggling with this 1985 article, in that article was one of the first things I encountered by one of the very first, UMass professors. So it wasn't just, Jim would always complain that the article was so good and wasn't so unavailable. It's like, no, it's not. That's not true. But not completely true. So anyway, so I came to the first time I appeared at UMass, kind of, it was the first in August or September, right before the semester started. I walk into a room in Mackmore Hall, and there's Arjun. He says, "You must be Geert," and I didn't know who anybody was in the room. And because Arjun was running the allocation meeting, and so I'm brand new, I don't know anything. It's like, so they helped me, and Arjun helped me. Like, but one of the things I had to pick was allocate was an office, and so Arjun said, "Oh, you should pick this up," because I had my lottery number was pretty good, and so Arjun said, "Oh, that's a good office for you," or whatever. And so but that office location ended up being very good because it was right across the graduate lounge, but more and next to the CPE office in Thompson, but also right 2 doors down from Jim Crotty's. And so part of my relationship with Jim comes because Arjun told me to pick this office. And and so when Jim was in his office 2 days a week, and sometimes some Korean graduate student would walk out, afraid, and he would be different thing, going in, but then he would just be around and wanting to shoot the shit. And then he would walk into my office, or I would walk into the office, and he would always like have all these conversations about things going on in the world, things going on in the department, all kinds of conversations that we would have. And that's kind of how we, for a few years, developed our relationship. Of course, in my 3rd semester, taking 705 or 706, was a transformative experience for many of us, for everybody in that class. And one of the things that, of course, we had to read Body and Karate and Jimsky, Jimsky and Dimsky and so on. But one of the main themes that I remember from the course was that he would always talk about the renegade Krotsky, because he was talking always about, he was trying to convince us about Keynes in this whole class. He had a mission about these things, and all of us, various anarchists or Marxists or whatever, were very skeptical of Keynes. And he would, was like, I'm the renegade Krotsky. And so he would always joke about these things, or, have these, these debates going back and forth with the whole class until like, and I think part of the stuff that he always brought up, always in all the conversations about this stuff, he says like, there is only one class enemy. There's only one enemy, is the class enemy. And I'll always be on the side of the working class, no matter what.
We're almost at the end of this list. Happy to call up Nina Eichacker.
So as complete luck would have it, I shared a desk with Geert. But no one told me to select that office during allocation. And really, that was one of the luckiest, best things that I did at UMass, choosing that office with no one telling me what was special about it. But that's how I met Jim. I met Jim the night of the faculty first year's pizza party. He introduced himself as a newly retired faculty member. And I said, "Oh, are you Sam Bowles?" And he was still nice to me after that. So Jim was a very, very special person who would reliably come to my office to see how I was doing. And if I said I was fine, he would say, "No, really, how are you doing?" And that's how I would tell him about math methods or having a less than great experience presenting new research. And throughout it all, he would say, "You are doing something valuable. There are many ways to do economics in a way that is important, in a way that describes the real world, in a way that supports what is good and what is better." And that's what I treasure about him. I was also thinking about how I remember that Karate Fest 1, being in this room as a first year grad student and having no idea what anyone was talking about. And what is a real testament to Jim and a testament to UMass's program is how I've come to understand so much more, to know and love so many people who've been in here, and to cite virtually everybody who presented in that first Festschrift. And I miss Jim a lot, but I'm just so happy that we're all here putting forward what he did in the world, which is to care about the world and to make it better.
Okay, so there's one more person I'm going to call up, and then we're going to take a short break for 15 minutes or so. Then we're going to come back, and then anybody who would like to speak here or in cyberspace will let me know. And we'll go on from there. So right now, I'm really pleased and honored to invite Alexis to come up and say a few words.
Okay, so I have my notes because I'm my mother's daughter, and I'm a little long-winded because I'm my father's daughter. Good afternoon. I am Alexis Dubiel, Lexi Crotty. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jim and Pam's middle daughter. And since I'm the only one speaking today, I can say without reservation, I was his favorite. So not true. What an honor it is to be here today to celebrate my father and his contributions to the economic world. He would be thrilled to see so many distinguished colleagues, many with whom he collaborated with, and friends taking time out of their hectic lives to make time for this today. We thank you. We also really want to thank Bob Poland and Jerry Epstein, not only for their years and decades of friendship, but also for always having such respect for my father, especially in the end of his life. Both of them made it possible for my father to finish his book late in life when writing became a little more difficult for him due to his illness. And for that, we're eternally grateful to both. Today, we gather here to celebrate our father's academic achievements and his indelible mark he's left in the field of economics. Our father's contributions extend beyond his research endeavors due to his unwavering commitment to teaching that has left an indelible impact on countless students over the years. He had the privilege of teaching and mentoring, and it was so fun to hear from so many of you today. Most of you know my dad is an economist, but he was so much more than that to us. I would be remiss to not acknowledge the love of his life, his wife for 62 years, my mom, Pam. She is so honored and delighted to be here today, and really so very touched that the university has chosen to celebrate my dad's accomplishments. For those accomplishments would not be possible without my mom's support, love, hard work, and dedication to her marriage and to our family. My parents raised 4 children together. My father was famous for saying, a 3-year-old, a 2-year-old, a 1-year-old, that was nothing. But a 14-year-old, a 15-year-old, and 16-year-old, something else. And then along came Aaron. He thought, though, with having 4 kids, that the likelihood at least of one of them liking him would go up exponentially. The opening of Crotty Hall was such a pinnacle of success for these 2 working class kids from the Bronx. My brother Tom had 2 sons graduate UMass Engineering School, and we joked that if they couldn't get a date on this campus when their last name was Crotty and a building was named after them, we had no sympathy. Who would have ever thought that a working class kid from the Bronx who spent his formative years backing up the Larkin brothers in bar fights would end up here? But my father was always brilliant, even back in the day. And although he left the Bronx, like many of you talked about today, to pursue his academic life, he was always true to his roots, and his childhood friends were lifelong. When my oldest son was little, my mom and dad came to celebrate his birthday. I was not a mom that bought toy guns. I was anti-violence. And my dad came into the kitchen and had told me that Tyler had shot him with a gun he made out of Legos. And I said, what did you say to him? And he said, without missing a beat, I shot him back. I grew up in the Bronx. Growing up the child of a radical economist certainly was not the run-of-the-mill childhood. When we were angry with my dad, we would threaten that we were going to marry a capitalist pig and live off the sweat and toil of others' labor. My siblings and I grew up going, instead of to summer camps, to IRPI, singing anti-war songs. And one of my fondest memories with my dad was watching him march around my kitchen in California with my daughter, carrying spatulas, singing Solidarity Forever, Dark as a Dungeon, and The Wild Colonial Boy, to name a few. We had one cat growing up called IRPI, and the other was Mao Zedong. As teenagers, Aaron can attest to the fact that we usually told our friends the cat's name was Meow. Again, not your typical childhood. We had a picture of Karl Marx in our living room. Again, as a teenager, we told our friends it might have been a picture of a long lost cousin. As we grew up, we began to appreciate my dad's passions. We learned so much from my father and my mother about kindness, respect, hard work, and love. We also learned so much about the importance of social justice, and that for that we're all so grateful. My father loved his childhood teams and was a big sports guy. Could tell you everything and anything you never wanted to know about the Yankees, Knicks, and New York Giants. We learned profanity from my father when any of those above teams were losing. He was a passionate athlete and grew up playing almost every sport and ended up loving rugby and distance running. He loved to brag that he held the mile record in his age category for the over 200-pound runners. We all got our love of sports from my dad. My dad worked hard as we grew into adults to create and nurture his relationship with us, and for that we're forever grateful. And although he adores all 4 of his kids, it was really all about the grandkids for him. He had 7 grandsons and offered $25,000 for anyone who would give him a daughter, thinking we were all done. At 44, I had Caroline, and I've yet to see the check. One grandson was born on his birthday. One just received his PhD on the same day 50 years later that my father had. One grandson was an economics major and read some of my dad's work in his classes. All of them love learning and love spending time with their grandparents. He loved introducing them to the Pink Panther and Mel Brooks, watching them play sports or participate in musicals. He loved vacationing with them in Maine and was always the first to be in the frigid water, ready to ride the waves. And he loved that they all loved mathematics. He loved his role as patriarch of the family. We would also like to, or I would like to, acknowledge my sister Erin, who is here today, for being the sole reason our father could remain living independently in his home with my mother. Erin selflessly became our dad's full-time caregiver and treated him with the love, compassion, respect, and humor he so deserved. My dad never dressed better. He had the coolest sneaker collection and fabulous hair products, all thanks to Aaron. She joked with him he would always have a great, as my 14-year-old daughter says, fit on her watch. Aaron has been an incredible support system for both of our parents, helping my mom navigate this new life without her life partner. And for that, my siblings, husband, and I are eternally grateful. Thank you, Aaron. My dad was blessed in his life in so many ways: a long-lasting marriage to the love of his life, 4 kids, and 8 grandchildren that adored him. But one of the biggest blessings was that he loved his job. He loved his job. He loved, as many of you said, the research, but he loved teaching and writing. He could captivate an auditorium full of macro or micro student undergraduates, including my husband, who, although he was dating the professor's daughter, only got a B in that class. His true passion, though, was his graduate students. He adored his time with graduate students, loved hosting them at our house with my mother, mentoring them, debating with them, and teaching those classes. He also loved research and writing. He loved his job and would have taught forever if his illness had not gotten the best of him. What a gift to love going to work every day. And that is what the University of Massachusetts and Perry gave to him for almost 50 years. You, all of his colleagues, were the very best, and his students gifted and bright, except for maybe that one student who completed his final, and my dad opened up his blue book to find a single drawing of an atomic bomb. Thank you all so much for honoring our father's academic achievements this weekend at the Karate Conference and his exceptional service as a teacher, as well as his impact he made on the university and with so many students. His commitment to excellence has been an inspiration to all of his kids, grandkids, and my mother. We are tremendously humbled and grateful to the university, the econ department, Harry, Bob and Jerry, and all of you, his esteemed colleagues and friends, for showing him and his contributions to economics this incredible respect and appreciation. Would have been thrilled. We're so touched, and he would have been so happy with this extraordinary distinction by people he so respected, admired, and loved. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for wonderful remarks. Well, Bob pointed out that it's already getting a bit late. So rather than take a break, and anybody's free to get up and take a break, but we thought it would be better to keep going. So if who you would like to speak, Steve and then Arjun. That's Steve? No, I'm sorry. Oh, yes, it is Steve. Okay. A lot of people are moving around here. Steve Cohen.
I don't have any stories to tell, but I wanted to say something to honor Jim. So I have a very brief comment. I think of Jim as a person combining Marx and Keynes and the Berrigan brothers, with an incredible sense of humor and an even more warmth. It was an honor to be his student and a gift to be his friend. I am glad there's a karate hall.
Thanks, Marx and Keynes and the Berrigan brothers. That's really something. Arjun.
So I wasn't planning to speak, but there was one thing that I just wanted to mention, which is that Jim could be very forgiving of people as well. You know, something that we don't always talk about. And I've written many dumb things in my life as an academic or just as a person. But maybe the single most stupid thing that I've ever written was a term paper for Jim called I feel embarrassed even saying this, new Keynesianism and post Keynesianism, is there any difference? Just even now I feel very much ado about nothing. Actually, that was the title, and yeah, you can imagine Eileen and others. So of course, there's a lot of red pen, but he was very kind about it. And years later, I went up to him sheepishly and I said, Jim, I wrote this paper, and he looked at me, and he made the sign of the cross. And he patted me on the cheek and said, "You're forgiven." And one more story of forgiveness, actually, and this is something where maybe 15 years after Gary and Eileen and others went through, you see, for you, it was Big Dog Meltzer, right? And he may have softened slightly because in our generation, he was merely son of a Big Dog Meltzer. So
Nancy.
It's really great. It's really great to be with all of you here. I'm just going to add a little riff on class and gender and their dialectical relationship. Back in the day, with the Center for Popular Economics, Jim Crotty giving a great talk to a group of trade union activists, very militant out there in their jeans and t-shirts. And Jim had them eating out of his hand. But as is often the case, there was one person in the audience who was not in a good mood and who was feeling kind of cranky and who raised her hand and said, "Really, Professor Crotty, do you think it's appropriate for a professor to give a public lecture in a t-shirt?" And he paused, his eyes got kind of big, and he kind of shrugged his shoulders and he said, "You know what, I should take it off?"
So Gary, I'll get to you in a minute. There's somebody online who wants to ask a question or say something. So can we move to that and then back?
My name is Ken Fox, and I think a few people know me. I was in the history department, and I came to UMass in September of 1972. And I had been a member of IRPI. I lived in Washington, D.C., where we had an IRPI chapter, and I was a member of that. So I got here, and I was looking for other people who were in IRPI or had even heard of IRPI. And there was one, Mike Best. I don't know how many of you, probably a lot of you do know Mike Best. I think he's now on another campus or something. So there was me and Mike Best, and we talked and we were friends and stuff. And then 1974, I forget what he was, the dean of the graduate school or something, put together this deal and got it funded to hire 8 new people in the economics department. And the arrangement was that 4 of them were going to be senior people who I think were all made full professors. And each one of those people was able to bring a junior person of their choice, who would also be, I suppose they would have been untenured. So, well, anyway, Jim was the junior person to Leonard Rapping, I guess coming from their relationship at Carnegie Mellon. So I guess Jim didn't have tenure probably when he got here. Now, various people have said things about Leonard, and I didn't know him very well, but he certainly had that reputation. But the other thing about his reputation was that he was on the board of editors of the AER. I don't know how that happened, but so that was a big deal. And I guess people know there was Sam Bowles, and his junior person was Herb. And then, what's his name? Rick Wolf was the junior person to, I forget, anyway. So now we had IRPI and we got to be a big chapter. But I was in history and it wasn't clear what it was going to mean for me. Also, I was untenured and I was on a line that you couldn't get tenure. So I found out later, I mean, I made friends with Jim. I found out later that Jim had gone to the administration and tried to see whether they could change my appointment to a tenure line. And it didn't work out, but I found this out about 2 years after he did it. And I mean, I'll always be grateful for that. But anyway, at the end of the 4th year, I was leaving. So, you know, I had to get people together to pack up my truck and stuff like that. And Jim called me up and he said, "Oh, Ken, we always wanted to have you over for dinner." And I said, "Yeah, okay, tomorrow I'm leaving." So I was invited over to dinner, which was really great. And next day, Jim showed up to help pack my truck and stuff, which was also very great. But it's important to me because people acted differently, of course, within IRPI. And Jim was one of a kind. And I miss him. I didn't realize, I mean, IRPI had the 50th anniversary here, whatever that was, in 2018. And Jim wasn't there. And I guess it has to do with his illness. I didn't know he was ill at that time, but we missed him a lot at that occasion. So that's my bit. Glad to have a chance to tell it to you. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Kenneth. Thank you. Okay, let's see who had their hand up. Gary.
So it's been a long ride here. I'm just going to give a couple snippets. First thing is, some people were saying I was Jim's first PhD student. That is not true. But there's another tradition you don't know about, maybe, unless you've been in this chain. Jonathan Goldstein, motorcycle riding, full beard having, bear of a man. And I went to a conference. I was already Jim's student. And I was suffering because he was very hard. Everything was criticism. And I saw Goldstein and we had a drink at the conference and I cried on his shoulder and he said, he acts like a beast, but he's a puppy underneath. So don't mind. So I then gave that talk to others as they came along. But Pam, I have a question. When you had the kids, Jim told us that he used to, at night, he would go and work in the bathtub because it was the only place in the house that was quiet and where he could turn the light. Is that true? And you know, yeah, you know.
Just when my dad, he would go into the bathroom because the crying from the colic. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah,
it was not Aaron or I. Just
that was made perfectly clear. They and you know, this was a story he would break out anytime you acted like you were working too hard. Like, yeah, I remember back in the day, but I had pressure myself because you were in my section one time in macro. Yeah, you were. I'm you know you did. But and I had my own talk with Jim on imposter syndrome and all that. But I just wanted to say, first of all, when it was 83, my wife Joanne at that time was pregnant with Jamal. Jamal was big story. He was going to come early. She had Braxton Hicks contractions that came early. And it was a crisis. She had to be bedridden for
3 months until Jamal could be born, as it turned out 1 month early. But thank God we got him to Cooley Dick and did all that. And we had a little house up in Northampton, and Jim showed up one day, and it was like little house, one of these hot little Massey houses, and it was summertime, and the bedroom was on the second floor. It was very hot. And so Jim showed up one day with a room air conditioner, and he trundled it in, and we set it up, and he just did that. And Joanne was able to be comfortable while she waited for our first child to be born. That was him. No, I'm sure he never told that story to anybody. That was just him. But actually, New York Football Giants was a problem, because once I got the Brookings Fellowship, I went down to DC, and for the first time, I could just write. And so I was, producing stuff and sending it up to Jim. And he got increasingly frustrated. At one point we talked, and he said, "You're writing this shit faster than I can read it," which meant, that the red pen. And then I went up for what was supposed to be a defense before I went over and got my job. He was, I was going to work at USC, and I was supposed to defend the thesis and then go out to SC. And basically he called me up. Now at that point, Jamal is 2 years old, living with me in DC, and temporarily, and he called me up. I had to go drive up to Massachusetts with my baby son, because Randall Bowser and Jim wanted to talk to me. And we had this meeting up in Thompson Tower, and he said, "We're not going to let you, there's a problem with your thesis." And I had this chapter that you'd call it stock flow consistent model now, but it was a macro model. And he's like, "There's a problem here. You detrended this thing, and it's wrong. We can't have this." And I said, "No, I took it right out of Tobin's, Nobel Prize lecture." They're like, "Really?" And they made me go over to the library, photocopy the thing, bring it back. Then he and Randall are looking at this thing, say, "No, it's wrong." And it was published there that when you get your Nobel Prize, you can make stupid mistakes too, but not right now. So that was that. But and actually then it took a while. The next spring I finished the thing up, and for months I said, "Jim, what do you think?" He said, "Oh, it's fine." But he knew I was going to one of those neoclassical places. I needed to be tough. So he upped the game so I could survive there. But I just wanted to say two things about food. One is that you'd think that and you love this person, you love the family and who they are, and so I had a chance to go make dinner for you guys one time, chicken teriyaki, and I was bragging about how the kids liked the chicken teriyaki. But the thing about your dad was that he was like a person of habits. 6 o'clock, you better have dinner on the table. And so I come home and the pressure is on, and cooking chicken teriyaki. I was like, is it ready? No, it was raw. I was so embarrassed to come to your house, and at least we had cats around that could sweep up the remains. But but then the other food story goes to Korea. We were sitting talking to Soo-Hang Kim and Hyun Hyo. Harry An was there, and we were talking to labor leaders in Seoul. And we were sitting having a strategic discussion, and in a bar or a restaurant, whatever, just hanging out in a place. And it was beer, popcorn, and seaweed. And I realized at some point that was dinner. And Jim looked at me with this kind of smile and said, "You're inside now, baby." That was him. He'll live in our hearts forever, always. And, as Fuentes once wrote, one lifetime is not enough to fulfill a destiny. And Jim's lifetimes go over many destinies.
Thank you, Gary. That was sweet. Anybody else would like to say something? Anybody online? Going once? Okay. You want a little, you want, oh, from Goldstein? Yeah, yeah. John Goldstein.
Somebody who wanted to be here today is another important part of the Maine Odyssey story of the Karate's coming to Maine every summer. And that's Jonathan Goldstein. I had been in communication with him about coming. He was going to come, and then something happened in his family. He's got to be somewhere in Chicago this week. He sends his regrets. So I was supposed to say that to you earlier. Goldstein was another one of those larger than life people for sure. His reputation preceded him, something about bashing down a door in Thompson Tower at some point. He drove, I think, a Harley back in the 70s, and, it's very scary to the average person. But those of us, somebody said earlier, behind that was really a sweetheart of a guy. One of the reasons, or one of the facets of the Karate's journey to the Maine every summer was that Jonathan, he was another kind of cranky guy. He took on the administration at Bowdoin all the time. He was not real well liked by the people there because he saw a certain amount of Ivy League corruption that he liked to use econometrics to attack in public. But he didn't do a lot of service work. He built houses, renovated this huge house and bought all these cabins. And so the next stop after the Goldenberg Hillard visit would be to go up to Goldie, as he called it. Everybody had a nickname. So go up to Goldie's place. And we had lots of lovely dinner there as well. So he really wanted to be here, and he just had something come up that seemed like would make it. So want to share you. Yeah.
Well, we've come to the end of just a wonderful day. It was just so heartwarming and so hilarious to hear all the stories about Jim, and so soulful and meaningful for me, and I hope for many of you. So thank you for all your contributions, for everything that you said. Thanks to Pam and Alexis and Aaron for coming. So before we break, I want to thank Nicole and Kim and Deb for keeping the lights on. We now have a reception downstairs to be followed by dinner. And tomorrow morning we'll start again. Breakfast starting at 8 here. And then the first session tomorrow will be at 9 o'clock up here in Gordon Hall. So thanks to everybody, and enjoy the rest of the time here. Good night.